Hello, and welcome back to another special research radio program that focuses on Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and his mission of achieving liberty, equality, and fraternity. I'm Abhishek, and in this week's episode, we'll focus on the implications of studying Ambedkar's texts in an Indian public university, the multiple forms of violence that caste thrives on, and the cultural ways in which the caste order is contested. My guest today is Parthasarathi Muthukkaruppan, who teaches in the Department of Cultural Studies at the English and Foreign Languages University, IFLU, in Hyderabad. Dr. Muthukkaruppan's research interests include cultural theory, literature, cinema, visual culture, and continental philosophy. We'll discuss his article titled Symbolic Violence Against Dalits Against Politics, published in EPW, as well as two other articles he's published elsewhere. I've shared links to all three in the show notes, and I do recommend reading them. Thank you for joining us, Partha. It's great to have you on the show.
Hi, Abhishek. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm very glad to be here.
Yes, likewise. So if we can start by discussing your course titled Introduction to Ambedkar that you teach at the master's level, what does a student's first day in the classroom look like?
For me, teaching Ambedkar is an academic activity, but I think it also bears certain historical and subjective attachments. I see this as a part of larger democratic practice. I think it is primarily a question about putting Ambedkar in the public, in the sense of presenting his ideas in a public university. It needs to be thought in association with placing his image or idol in public place. And if you think in those terms, it has its own historicity and politics. I also think this particular kind of practice has undergone a whole lot of change in the 35 years. That is putting Ambedkar in the public. When I grew up in the 80s and 90s in southern parts of Tamil Nadu, Ambedkar statues were established and defended by very ordinary people with the exemplary courage and militancy. At times, it was a legal battle against the whole state machinery. There were stories of bitter street fights behind most of the Ambedkar statues which are put up in the public on the streets. If you think about the images of Ambedkar, putting up the images in the public, one may find the mainstream cinematic representations of Ambedkar. Often you will find this official cliche image at the police stations and the courtrooms. You will find it in cinematic representation. Very often, along with Gandhi and Nehru, in at once there is an invocation of both law as well as the nationality in this particular official representation of Ambedkar. You also know that there is a history of political images of Ambedkar being presented in the public as a democratic emblem. This is a circulation among the very ordinary people of this country through the modes of wall posters, calendars, stickers on two-wheelers and cars, marriage invitation cards, and framed photographs in the entrances of small houses. Today you also find the whole lot of flexi banners carrying Ambedkar's images. There has been a whole history of putting Ambedkar in the public, and it was not an easy one. Perhaps this putting Ambedkar's ideas in a public university cannot be divorced from the whole history. Today, if you think there is a gesture of relative acceptance of Ambedkar among the general public, more so in the case of university campuses, Ambedkar is not received with animosity as much as how the case used to be. I would even think that Ambedkar has become a symbol of democratic protests in contemporary India. As you see, the complaints today is not the lack of representation in the public, but the excess of representation, often articulated as appropriation of Ambedkar. The same holds for academic and intellectual world of writing, publishing, and teaching. Teaching Ambedkar in the university is also, in my case, made much easier by my senior colleagues in the department. Though I grew up in the family that had books of Marx, Periyar, and Ambedkar, it is at EFL University, as a student, I had learned the political significance of Ambedkar's ideas. Department of Cultural Studies, where I teach, it has got a very good faculty. It has a genuine engagement with questions of caste, and increasingly young people want to read Ambedkar. We in the department offer not only exclusive courses on Ambedkar, many courses indeed have readings drawn from Ambedkar's works at master's and PhD level. I think what makes distinct our teaching Ambedkar is the way courses have been curated, where Ambedkar is read along with the questions of culture, representation, subjectivity, and so on.
Right. And would you like to share what a day in the for a day in a classroom might look like?
There has been a overwhelming reception and enthusiasm in reading Ambedkar, especially among the young people, and they show unprecedented kind of enthusiasm in the classrooms. They are excited to read Ambedkar, both his ideas as well as texts talking about his life, the kind of life which parallels with the modern Indian history.
Okay. Yeah, and to transition to the actual research that you've conducted, in one of your articles, you've written that, quote, societies have been exhausted in certain parts of the country by the fieldworks of social anthropologists. Political scientists since the 1960s have identified caste as a vital category to analyze national elections and study the voting behaviors of what they have called vote banks, end quote. So, could you tell me more about how social scientists have, broadly made sense of the term caste itself, and perhaps, one or two limitations that you identify with this broader scholarship so far?
Perhaps I should start with Ambedkar's injunction from his modernist text, Annihilation of Caste. I think this is also circulated as a quote across internet and social media. This is I quote: "You cannot build anything on the foundations of caste. You cannot build up a nation. You cannot build up a morality. Anything that you will build on the foundations of caste will crack and will never be a whole." These are the lines from Annihilation of Caste. Ambedkar spoke these words in the context of 20th century, early 20th century historical context, and it was a plea for the dialectical understanding of political and social reform. The implied meaning here is that caste is an evil force that ought to be annihilated. I think a genuine social science research on caste shall begin from the premise, with this particular premise, with the passion for the social transformation. That's what I think. If you look at the social science scene in India, caste as an object of analysis has found a place largely in social sciences, and there is you can see conspicuous absence of caste in the debates around history and historiography. That is to say that caste as a specific research object has been allocated a specific disciplinary space. It doesn't appear in the disciplinary space of history, but rather it appears in social anthropology. So there is a distribution of certain kind of intellectual labor. So perhaps the exception here would be the newly emerging field of Dalit studies. There is a focused thinking on historiography and caste. In a sense, one can say that caste has become an anthropological object. It has become it's only the anthropologists who largely engaged with the questions of caste. Perhaps I would also say that they have failed to pay attention to the embedded violence in the caste relationship, the evil part which Ambedkar kind of insists that ought to be annihilated, and on the subjugation of the people at the receiving end. This particular part is somehow was not a concern for social scientists. They end up producing depoliticized, cold analysis that is common to the much of the social science literature on caste. If you look at the prominent political theoreticians, the ones who work at the level of theory and history, one finds repeated justification, theoretical defense of caste by presenting caste as a certain governing rationality of a kind distinct from the Western societies. So this is a one type of writing. There are also political scientists and also journalists who look at data of electoral democracy, party system, elections, and they continue to imply that caste as a productive force that challenges communalism and a kind of agent that can restore a democracy, etc. So, coming back to the anthropological works on caste, I can give you a small example. There has been a debate within the anthropology. Almost every anthropologist engaged with this debate. This is about the structure of caste system to understand who is at the top of the system, whether it is the Satriya, who is the king, holds political power, or the Brahmin who has the ritual superiority over others. So much so that a scholar has called this as a central conundrum of Indian sociology, social ideology. The fact of the matter, our concern is to ask, whatever the case, whether it is a Brahmin or Kshatriya who's on the top of the model, the question is to ask who are the people most vulnerable in the structure and who are at the receiving ends, who are the subjugated populations exposed to brutal forms of violence on an everyday basis. This is the kind of question a social science inquiry should begin from the premise, right? So the social science, objective science, with their frames, somehow do not address these questions, and this becomes a serious problem, especially when you want to understand caste as a kind of violence, which involves questions of suffering, humiliation, trauma, and pain. And there is no subjective space for subjective narrative in the social science literature. That's why there is a scope in the literary narratives to address some of these questions. Finally, the social science studies also somehow impose a view that caste can exist as merely cultural. I would call this kind of multi-casteism or caste pluralism, a peaceful coexistence of different castes together. It's a kind of depoliticized understanding about caste. This has to be confronted with Ambedkar's structuralist dictum. The outcast is a byproduct of caste system. There will be outcasts as long as there are castes. So this is the kind of idea we have to confront this model of peaceful coexistence of castes, cultural difference, etc.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I never thought of this multicultural, multi-caste perspective. Like, oh, all the castes can just exist, and there's no violence associated with the caste system. So that was quite insightful. Besides the other examples of the problems and lack of urgency with social sciences on addressing the caste hierarchies, the caste order. So I wanted to also discuss the kinds of words that are used, and the importance of it, because this is a topic that you explore quite deeply in your research, and we noticed these discussions take place in popular media where there are pressures that affect the choice of words that are used to oppress that are used to describe the oppressed castes in South Asia, right from the Modi government's decision to media houses to discontinue the use of the term Dalit in 2018, to criticism against Gandhi's use of the word Harijan as a paternalistic framing of a structure governed by violence by caste Hindus. So, if you can maybe give us a snapshot of three words and the pressures that the terms are faced, Dalits, Harijans, and scheduled castes.
As you know, naming is a conspicuous ideological act, and to name something is to assign or allocate a place in the horizon of social and historical order. If you look at some of the categories used to refer to Dalits, in the post-independence India, there are certain names that continue to be used from the colonial period. For instance, scheduled caste and Harijan. These are the first one is a more of a governmental category, and the second one is more of a ideological one associated with Gandhi and Congress party. To begin with, the category SC, scheduled caste, it was a constitutional category created to kind of in the production of subjects for the state welfare. So it is drawn from the 1936 schedule for the purpose of implementing special electoral representations in the Government of India Act. So later, the schedule was also reproduced in 1950s President's Order, etc. The interesting thing about this category is that since 1950, so there is a binding on this category that particularly after the President's Order, the official records of Indian state continue to describe untouchables, I mean the scheduled castes, as Hindus. So it means as long as you remain within the Hindu fold, you are entitled to the welfare which is meant for the scheduled castes. There are quite a different stories about the Sikhs and the Buddhists. They have a different story. So this basically is a category which has to be thought in terms of governmentality, policy, and welfare state, etc. So it has its own stigma. People have written about it. If you think about Harijan, another category, It's a kind of popularized in the 1930s in the nationalist politics by Gandhi and his engagement with the questions of untouchability. So Gandhi had a dual purpose in engaging with untouchables. On the one hand, it was to bring the populations of untouchables into the national politics. On the other hand, it is also to retain them within the lower rungs of Hindu majority society. So it is understood that Gandhi borrowed this term from Narsin Mehta, a kind of figure in the 15th century Gujarati Bhakti tradition. The term was used to kind of to refer to the devotees across caste and creed. There was a sense of universalism. So Gandhi, by using it exclusively to refer to untouchables, he actually re-signified the term and kind of deconstructed the universal nature of the term. So it's no longer a term refers to people across castes and creeds, which the Bhakti would have thought about. But here it is exclusively a reference to untouchables. So perhaps this is the kind of act. It faces a kind of polemic from someone like Mayavadi, which was largely reported in the newspapers, asking that if we are the children of God, is he the child of Satan? This was reported in the newspapers as Mayavadi polemically stated. So this is a category which is largely located within the particular ideology of reform, kind of initiated by Gandhi, which puts the Hindus in the burden of emancipating the Harijan as a penance for their sins, etc. It's a particular kind of idealism which never captures the structural dimensions of caste and its operation in the society. When it comes to Dalit, the term can be located in the Ambedkar's hermeneutic. In his historical dialect, one can locate the term, and also in the revolutionary enunciations of Dalit Panthers of Maharashtra. So it has its own history, a political history, I would say. Somehow I feel today that the term Dalit and its exclusive usage for untouchables, often seen synonymous with scheduled castes, I think the term has been stigmatized as much as the other terms, and also it is stripped of its political potentialities. So it is high time to ask if subjectivities are constituted through discourses and languages, what is a language that Dalit speak? This is a question one has to think about it. On the other hand, Dalit, the term also has dissented from, it was a revolutionary category in the Panthers' imagination. It's a universal category.
Yes. I just wanted to clarify this using an excerpt from one of his articles where he says, quote, having the critique of majoritarian Hindu religion central to its politics, Dalit Panthers included scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, neo-Buddhists, who were untouchables that converted to Buddhism during and after Ambedkar's historical public act of converting to Buddhism in 1956, the working class, landless poor, peasants, and women as part of the collective called Dalit. Yes, please go ahead.
It has descended from a category of becoming to a category of being. However, for the practical purposes, it serves as a referential category in the media houses and also in academia. So I think it is also a kind of challenge to the way one imagines any new category transgressing and overcoming caste and challenges to that kind of a imagination. I think this imagination of non-caste identity has implications from the larger questions of the unsettled nature of Indian national identity and contestations around that.
And do you want to elaborate? Is it possible for you to elaborate on what you spoke about, the becoming versus the beings? I found that quite insightful.
When you think about Dalit as a becoming, a kind of a subject position, so you are not a Dalit by birth. You become a Dalit. You're kind of a transgressing the given identity and occupy that space. It's not an easy move that kind of like a snake removing its skin off. It's a kind of a historical kind of a struggle, and one has to overcome a lot of difficulties and occupy that place of the category of becoming. It is also open to any community. Anybody can become a Dalit. There are different levels of difficulties, different levels of privileges, which are operative. Nevertheless, the possibilities are open. There is a hope for the transforming the caste identity and occupying an identity which is not necessarily constituted by caste but something else. That opportunity is possible when you think about Dalit as a category of becoming. But when you reduce the category into a category of being, being what you are, how you are born, is a kind of sociological category, not as a transformative historical category, but sociological category. You stigmatize this category and reduce into a kind of identity of given identity. So that's what happens with equating Dalit with either biological identity or governmental identity. So there is no imagination here. So I feel how it was an identity of becoming at once with the revolutionary imaginations of Panthers. Now it has descended into a kind of identity of being. So it's also a kind of stigmatized kind of identity.
Yeah. And transitioning to, speaking about the way that some of your other work that where you've looked at violence in not just the visible forms, but also at the structural and symbolic levels. So Dr. Ambedkar, as you paraphrase, believed that, quote, the formation of the entity called untouchable was animated not by love among the constituencies of the four Varnas, but through their shared hatred towards the untouchables, end quote. So, could you tell us more about your research on violence based on these three layers that you identify?
What you refer to in that essay is a response to a particular way of framing the question about untouchability as a intersubjective relation between Dalit and Brahmin. So my point in that essay is about limitations of such a framing where the larger questions of structural and symbolic violence, which is operative behind this particular Dalit Brahmin relationship, as a invisible background, or if you want to put it as the conditions which make the possibility of this unequal interaction between a Dalit and a Brahmin. So this was the point which I was trying to make, and this particular invisible background I suggested, drawing from Ambedkar, is operative with the kind of ideological separation of touchable and untouchable, with what Ambedkar calls it as a graded sovereignties and graded inequalities. There are layers of castes within the world of touchables, and the relationship between the touchable and the untouchable is in a way governed by the symbolic order of caste, which is what he calls it as a shared hatred for the untouchable. So that touchables share a common hatred for the untouchable. So this is basically to pay attention to the invisible background within which one has to think about a relationship like Dalit and Brahmin. Also to say that when you don't pay attention to this background, you miss this structural and symbolic violence which is operative. When it comes to my own work on violence, my primary work explores caste violence as a historical problem in modern India. Usually, we seek to understand caste violence, taking resort to television, newspaper report, fact-finding reports, civil and human rights organizations, and their fact-finding reports. And also, you find government statistics on caste-based crimes. All of them follow more or less same genre convention, which is empirical in nature, and they also kind of go with the same logic that this is a violation of human rights, etc. The only, I think, only archive of knowledge which gives a different view on caste violence for me is the literary production of the past 5 decades. It gives a different peek at the everyday horrors of caste violence. Secondly, caste violence is generally understood to be a problem exclusively to India or Hindu religion. Often, the solutions are sought either in a legal or religious reform. At times, caste is framed as a violence of human rights, as I told you earlier. My work actually demonstrates how caste violence works in different forms, such as symbolic, systemic, and also brutal or everyday forms, and how all these three forms are mutually reproduce and complement each other. So in a way, it's an attempt to theoretically understand caste violence with the premise of transformatory ethics of annihilation of caste, which was insisted by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So in a way, it's also exploring the conditions of possibility for a annihilation of caste. So in that sense, my work goes against the general stands of thinking about caste and presents it as a kind of not purely in terms of a structuralist understanding of caste, but rather also as a historical problem of modern India. So it cannot be reduced to a problem of a legal mechanism or a social mechanism, which can be addressed through some kind of a reform. So in my own framing, caste violence, it is something to do with a form of nation state and the kind of liberal democracy we live in. So my work also establishes kind of argues for a necessary theoretical turn against existing empiricism around caste violence. So all the literature about caste violence produce certain kind of a empirical object of caste violence. So my work is also kind of overcoming that empirical object and to attempt to produce caste violence as a theoretical and historical problem.
Right, right. And is there anything that you'd like to say about more about like liberal democracies that you have started talking about?
The works on Indian democracy in India never address the question of caste violence. Somehow, it is possible for political theoreticians in India to elaborate on the political form of Indian democracy without paying any attention to the structural forms of caste violence which is embedded in this society. So, on the other hand, there is an innumerable number of studies focusing on caste violence, trying to understand caste violence within the specific sociological village and other contexts, and produce certain kind of a case studies, kind of a closer studies. They do not speak to the questions around the political form of this country. So my work, in a way, is about a kind of thinking about caste violence, not as a kind of problem of a specific village or a specific sociological context, rather as a problem that is to do with the modern political form we have and how caste violence as a modern form, it is kind of established certain kind of nexus with the political form. This is the kind of questions why I try to explore by asking larger theoretical questions when one thinks about caste violence, in a way also to kind of liberate caste violence from the clutches of empiricism and sociological kind of case studies.
Yeah, and focusing in on the aspect about symbolic violence, just to get deeper into this, you've mentioned in your article that quote, if the symbolic order is structured to assign a subordinate position to the untouchable, Dalit articulations expose this nature of the symbolic. The untouchables do not necessarily share the symbolic world with the oppressors.
Right. For me, the symbolic world of caste it has overt and implicit prescriptions. It may include how one should carry oneself in the public or private, with whom one should eat with or share a cup of tea with, whom should one marry, whom should one interact with, and how should one interact with, or whom should one go around with. The list can be exhaustive. The symbolic world is structured by the modalities of graded sovereignties and inequalities. So it also has a rule of difference in a sense. It is not a single rule for everyone to follow. The rule is different for different graded levels. So it is operative in that kind of a level. So this particular symbolic force, in many ways, shapes the habitus of individuals and groups. You know how you respond to certain questions, certain situations, etc. And this symbolic order seeks obedience and fidelity from the individual subjects. This is how caste works in a society. So this is the process by which the individual dispositions of people's beliefs and values and practices, all that is shaped in a society. And this is not done in a conscious inculcation of values. So this is done in a way that at the level of unconscious. It means you don't know what you have learned today. So that's how that even the children practice. They know about the inferiority of untouchables, the upper caste children. So it is not that they have been taught, sit and educated. Okay, this is a kind of long durational formation of values and opinions taking place at a discursive level of consciousness. This is a symbolic world, kind of operative, like a kind of ideological state apparatuses, which Althusser calls it. Similarly, this is ideological apparatus of caste, which governs everyday conducts of people and minds and their bodies. So, if this is the symbolic world, so do the marginal groups obey and be faithful to the symbolic order? This is the question. So, this question needs to be kind of interrogated. So, I suggest by kind of invoking Ambedkar's invocation of Thucydides to state that the untouchable articulations of everyday life brings some kind of rupture to this symbolic whole. So, the subaltern groups, through their acts of disobedience, and they clearly threaten the symbolic order of caste. I would also think whenever there is an act of physical violence of caste today, it is symptomatic of the crisis of the symbolic order. Right? If you want to give an example, you see that there are stories in newspaper reports about upper caste people raising walls, concrete walls, blocking Dalits from entering their street, entering their temple area, etc. So it is clearly a symptomatic of the crisis of the symbolic order of caste. The untouchables of that particular region no longer abide by the symbolic order of caste, symbolic values and prescriptions. They keep transgressing it. So caste has to be guarded with erupting physical wall, right? So this is in that sense, Ambedkar's invocation gives primacy to the issue of class interest within the society, and also a kind of challenge to the foundational myth of the caste society, as everybody is faithful to this symbolic order and society. So this is the foundational myth. This is what precisely gets ruptured in the small acts of disobedience of the subaltern groups.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also I think nicely flowing to the the last question that I had in mind, which is about it was something that you hinted at early in the conversation, which was about the poetry, the cultural production of the poetry and autobiography. So specifically since your research interest is also as a scholar of cultural studies, if you can walk us through maybe one or two examples of authors that have used poetry and autobiography and have challenged the caste order to and moved us closer to the goal of annihilating caste.
Teaching in the Department of Cultural Studies, I have realized it's very important to reconstruct Ambedkar's theory of hermeneutics. This necessarily involves Ambedkar's conception of language, discourse, ideology. There is a whole lot of things one can actually put together from Ambedkar to make a Ambedkar's theory of hermeneutics. I can give one quick example and elaborate the point. As many popularly understand annihilation of caste, it is, I wouldn't say it's a misunderstanding, but there is a popular understanding that Ambedkar has proposed intercaste marriages and interdining as a kind of solution to the problem of caste. Many people believe that. Many read annihilation of caste at that level. I wouldn't agree with that kind of a reading. Let us look at this small passage in Ambedkar where he says, quote, "Caste is not a physical object like a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire, which prevents the Hindus from commingling and which is therefore to be pulled down. Caste is a notion, is a state of mind. The destruction of caste does not therefore mean the destruction of physical barrier." This passage, I think people can find this passage in Annihilation of Caste. For me, the interesting part of Ambedkar's this particular passage and its argument is that he located the question of annihilation of caste at the very contested terrain of ideological and discursive register. Caste is not a matter of palpable objects. It has to be located at a level of discourse, at the level of ideology. So caste is not a tangible object. It's constituted by mentalities, beliefs, values, and mediated by ideological function of sastras. So this is what the legitimacy of sastras need to be undermined. This is the overall point of annihilation of caste. And needless to say that Ambedkar is not denying the materiality of caste as it works in the real life conditions. The point here is about the discursive sites themselves are material. Indeed, caste is produced and reproduced, and new conditions for the existence of caste are produced at the level of discourse, right? So this also something to do with what I have called the symbolic world of caste. So in a sense, Ambedkar's utopia of annihilation of caste, utopian project of annihilation of caste, it is not something that a kind of imagination where there is no ideological regime. So today there is a caste ideological regime of caste is governed by sastras. It has its own symbolic world, whereas the one which envisioned by Ambedkar also has set up beliefs and practices, and that's what has to replace the existing one. That's where Ambedkar's idea of liberty, equality, fraternity, and all that values of dignity and self-respect come into place, right? So this is in, as a practitioner of cultural studies, Ambedkar's locating this question of annihilation of caste as a question of signification and at the level of signifiers and meanings, and largely at the level of discourse, is quite interesting. And to quote one of the founding figures of cultural studies, Stuart Hall, and this is precisely the hope one finds in Ambedkar, that Stuart Hall would say that the meanings, the realm of meanings and discourse are not settled forever. The possibilities are open for a resignification of identities, names, meanings, etc. That's where the hope for annihilation of caste lies. So that's what I would think.
Right. I think that's a nice segue to our rapid fire round, which is the last stage of this conversation. And I'd like to start with the first question, which is, what's one aspect of Dr. Ambedkar's writing and actions that you'd like to learn more about?
One of the curious questions which I try to explore whenever I read Ambedkar is Ambedkar's intervention into the then existing Marxist philosophy. So Ambedkar is intervening into the Marxist philosophy and engaging with basic tenets of Marxism at a point when there is no Althusser, there is no Gramsci, and the base and superstructural dialectic, the old model was intact. And within India, the whole lot of conservatives occupy the place of Marxism and Marxist practice. And this also has something to do with my own interest in thinking about Ambedkar beyond the frames of liberalism and beyond the frames of Gandhiism.
What's something that you're skeptical in Dr. Ambedkar's work?
One problem which I think is a productive problem, which I keep finding it difficult, is Ambedkar's thinking about the non-caste possible identities populations can occupy, right? So there is a whole lot of diagnosis about caste question and how we understand the society, etc. But when it comes to transforming, identities are quite important for any individual and for societies. I think there is a productive lack in Ambedkar, which is to think about the identity that forthcomes after caste. What is the subject that one has to occupy in a post-caste societies, right? That is the thinking which is not readily available in Ambedkar. One has to critically engage with Ambedkar and make a way forward from Ambedkar. I think so. In that sense, I think when many people frame this problem, in a very reductionist fashion, to think about Ambedkar, then add up Marx, then add up Buddhism. So I would actually think in a very different way to think that there is a philosophy of Ambedkar, which one finds it, not addressing these questions directly, but there is also possibility of Ambedkarism, the whole set of scholars who work critically engage with Ambedkar and expand, critically reformulate Ambedkar's ideas, and at times critique Ambedkar's ideas and reject. There's a whole lot of vibrant intellectual activity, which one can call it as a field of Ambedkarism. So it is the Ambedkarism and the Ambedkar, philosophy of Ambedkar together, can make a way forward.
Right.
That's what I think.
And a related question is, the last one is, what recommendation would you have to further and unify fragmented social movements?
I think it's a very difficult and also practical question. And perhaps what needs to be thought is, what is the source of the fragmentation? For instance, when you say Dalit politics today, as far as I know, there is no single social movement today which is quite contented with identifying this movement as simply as Dalit movement. There is, beyond this identity of Dalit, there is always a search for a new identity, whether it can be from language-based identity or sometimes identity which is drawn from religion. And if you look at some of Ambedkar's works itself, that religious identity becomes very significant and inevitable in thinking about a transformative new society. So in a way, that having an identity of a kind of a residual identity, in a sense that identity which is not based on caste, an identity which is defined in terms of its negative relation with caste, is not adequate. So there is a search for new identity. Perhaps, so these fragmentations, what one thinks, which kind of ruptures the unity of social movements, maybe to our surprise, could be a productive kind of a fragment, which would actually enable us to further think about ways in which we can imagine new identities, which would actually undermine the caste identity and kind of forge a new society where the identities of caste are less significant, and the new identities based on new logics will have a more relevance and more currency. So that's what I can say.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and on that note, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on Research Radio. I think it was an exhaustive and very a challenging way of understanding violence that we'll try to spend some time trying to really get to the depth of. And I think your articles will also help us get to that stage as well. So thank you.
So I'm glad that I've been part of this EPW podcasts. Thank you so much for our team and you, and it's been a great pleasure. Nice experience.
I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation with Dr. Parthasarathi Muthukkaruppan and consider exploring his articles for more insights. We'll be back with a new episode on Wednesday as a part of our new program that explores multiple dimensions of Dr. Ambedkar's thought and practice one week after another. Take care, and until next week.